The candle had burned low by the time Marwyn found the scroll. He had been in the restricted vaults beneath the citadel for near on 6 hours, though time moved strangely in that windowless dark. The air hung thick with the smell of old parchment and lamp oil, and something else, something ancient and faintly acrid, like the memory of fire long extinguished. His back ached from hunching over crates, and his fingers had gone grey with dust. But he'd learned months ago not to complain. Novices who complained about their duties found themselves scrubbing chamber pots rather than studying the mysteries of the world. Looking for something in particular, boy? Marwyn startled, nearly dropping the wooden box he'd been examining. Archmaester Theobald stood in the doorway, his silver chain catching the lamplight. The old man's face was all deep carved lines and suspicion, like a cliff worn by harsh winds. "Just cataloguing, Archmaester," Marwyn said, which was true enough. "Archmaster Walgrave assigned me to—" "Walgrave forgets his own name half the time," Theobald interrupted, shuffling closer. His robes whispered against the stone floor. "What you're truly doing down here, I wonder? Seeking secrets, glory, some scrap of forgotten knowledge to make your name?" Marwyn felt heat rise to his face. "I seek only to serve the citadel." The sound conveyed profound disbelief. "You're Marwyn of— where was it?" "Old Town, Archmaester. My father keeps an inn near—" Yes, the nephew." Theobald waved a spotted hand dismissively. "Your uncle left the citadel 20 years ago, boy. Ran off to dabble in sorcery and other fool's pursuits. I hope you've more sense than he did." The name hung unspoken between them. Marwyn the Mage, his father's brother, now off in Essos chasing rumors of magic and dragons. The citadel did not speak fondly of him. "I only wish to learn, Archmaester." "Learning." Theobald's laugh was dry as the parchment surrounding them. "Dangerous thing, learning. Especially learning from books that should stay closed." His eyes fixed on the box in Marwyn's hands. "What have you got there?" "I don't know yet. It was misfiled among records of grain tithes from—" "Let me see it." Marwyn handed over the box. It was plain wood, water-stained and warped with age, with no marking save a symbol burned into the lid. 3 wavy lines, perhaps representing water or smoke. Theobald examined it with the careful precision of a man who had spent 50 years among texts, then set it on a nearby table. "Leave it," he said flatly. "But Archmaester, I should at least catalogue." "I said leave it." The old man's voice hardened. "Some knowledge is better left buried, boy. The world turns without us digging up every corpse of every dead empire. Do you understand?" Marwyn swallowed. "Yes, Archmaster." "Good. It's near time for supper. Go on." But as Marwyn climbed the worn stairs back to the upper levels of the citadel, something nagged at him. The way Theobald had looked at that box, not with the mild curiosity of a scholar, but with something closer to fear. He returned 3 nights later. It wasn't difficult. The vaults were never locked, merely discouraged. The citadel held that knowledge should be preserved, but not necessarily pursued, a philosophy Marwyn had never quite understood. What was the purpose of keeping books if no one read them? The box sat where Theobald had left it, gathering a fresh coating of dust. Marwyn glanced over his shoulder, though he knew himself alone. The only sounds were his own breathing and the distant drip of water through ancient stone. He opened the box. Inside lay a scroll, or what remained of one. The The parchment had been burned along one edge, the damage old enough that black had faded to brown. The outer wrapping had mostly disintegrated, but the inner layers had survived, protected by, he touched it carefully, what felt like wax, though harder dragon bone, perhaps, ground and mixed with beeswax, as the Valyrians had once done for their most precious documents. His heart hammered as he unrolled it with infinite care. The script was Valyrian, the high formal dialect used by the dragonlord families. Marwyn had studied it. All novices did, for many of the Citadel's oldest medical texts had come from the freehold. But he'd never seen an original document. The ink had faded to rust brown and whole sections were illegible. But what remained the 16th day of the third moon in the year 114 before the date marker was partially burned away. But Marwyn's breath caught. Before what? Before the conquest? No, the phrasing was wrong. Could it mean before the doom? His hands shook as he continued reading Ionis, Balearis, son of Valor, of the house Balearis. Sworn to the dragonlords, Targaryen do set down this account for another gap, that those who come after might understand what we. Smoke damage obscured several lines. The 14 flames burn bright, and all believe our glory shall last. A Valyrian journal, a genuine account from before the doom. Marwyn looked up, half expecting Theobald or another archmaester to materialize from the shadows and snatch it away. But he remained alone with the guttering lamp and the whisper of his own pulse in his ears. My duties take me often to the mines beneath the third flame, where the slaves work the deep galleries. The overseers report that productivity has fallen, though they know not why. The slaves mutter in their own tongues Giscari and Sarnori and other languages of the sheep peoples, but will not speak plainly even under the lash. There is fear in their eyes that I mislike, Marwyn read on, squinting at the damaged text. The journal appeared to be a record of administrative duties, the sort of mundane documentation that might have been kept by a minor noble overseeing mining operations. Yet there was something else. A current of unease running beneath the formal language brought the matter to Lord Dracon of House Balearis, who dismissed my concerns. The slaves are always fearful, he said. It is their nature, as it is the nature of sheep to flee wolves. But I have overseen these mines for 4 years. No, and this is different. They are not afraid of us. They are afraid of something below. The entry ended there, and the next several pages were too badly damaged to read. Marwyn carefully unfurled more of the scroll, conscious that the parchment might crumble at any moment. The next legible section bore a date some weeks later, another collapse in the deep galleries. 7 slaves lost their bodies, not recovered. Lord Dracon ordered the tunnel sealed and a new shaft dug. But Maester Indros. The title gave Marwyn pause. The citadel had not existed in Valyria's time, yet clearly the freehold had its own tradition of learned men. Warns that we delved too deep too quickly. The mountains are old, he said, older than our freehold, older than the long night itself. There are places the earth does not wish disturbed. I thought him merely fearful of the dark until he showed me a carving found in one of the sealed tunnels. The stone was black but not Valyrian work. The style was something older, stranger shapes that hurt to look upon too long. Lord Dracon had it destroyed. Marwyn's lamp chose that moment to flicker, and he nearly jumped from his skin. His mouth had gone dry. He wanted to stop reading to rewrap the scroll and return it to its box and forget he'd ever found it. but his fingers continued to unroll the parchment, as though possessed of their own will. The tremors grow more frequent. The 14 assure us there is no cause for concern, that the flames have burned thus for 5,000 years and shall burn for 5,000 more. But I have spoken with the old slave woman who tends the household shrine. She is Giscari, captured when she was young, and she remembers tales from before the freehold conquered her people. The dragons did not always fly here, she told me. Before your people came with fire and blood, this was a dead place, a place where even the old ones feared to walk. When I asked what she meant by old ones, she would not say, only made a sign against evil and returned to her work. The lamp guttered again. Marwyn realized he'd been holding his breath. A sound echoed from the upper levels, footsteps on stone. He quickly rolled up the scroll and placed it back in its box, then positioned himself at a nearby shelf as if he'd been cataloguing all along. The footsteps passed without descending, but his heart continued to race. He should stop. He should leave this alone, just as Theobald had warned. These were dead languages and deader empires, as the Citadel was fond of saying. What did it matter what some Valyrian overseer had written 400 years ago? But he thought of the dragons. Everyone had heard the tales from across the narrow sea. Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, walking out of a pyre with 3 living dragons. Impossible, the Maesters said. Exaggeration rumor. Yet the reports continued from too many sources to be entirely dismissed. And if dragons had returned, Marwyn picked up the box and carried it to his cell. He worked on the translation for a fortnight, snatching moments between his other duties. Copying it out was dangerous. If another master saw what he was doing, questions would be asked. So he worked from memory, setting down what he'd read in his own cipher. Archmeister. Wargrave caught him on the 12th day. What's that you're scratching at, boy Marwyn? Nearly upset his ink. Translation practice. Archmaster High Valyrian, as you instructed. Wargrave leaned close, his eyes roomy and vague. The Archmeister's chain clinked softly links of every metal the Citadel forged. Once he'd been the greatest master of ravens and old law in the Citadel. Now he sometimes forgot whether he'd eaten breakfast. Valyrian. Wargrave murmured. Yes, pretty language. Useless, of course. All dead, all gone. His spotted fingers touched the parchment. What text is this? Just exercises. Archmaest. Strange word there. He tapped one of Marwyn's transcriptions. That's not classical Valyrian. That's older. Before the freehold codified the high speech. His eyes sharpened, and for a moment, Marwyn glimpsed the brilliant scholar Wargrave had once been. Where did you find this? The vaults. It wasn't a question. You've been in the restricted vaults, haven't you? Found something old Theobald told you to leave alone. There was no point in lying. Yes. Archmeister Wargrave was quiet for a long moment. Then he settled into a chair with a sigh, his moment of clarity fading like mist. Knowledge is a burden, boy. The more you know, the heavier the load. I've spent 60 years filling my head with facts and histories and lore. And you know what it's brought me. Sleep troubled by nightmares of things I can't quite remember and can't quite forget. I don't understand. Archmaster, no. You wouldn't. Walgrave's hand trembled slightly as he returned the parchment. You're like your uncle was, like I was once. You think knowledge is a treasure to be won. You don't yet understand it can also be a curse. He stood slowly, joints creaking. There are some things the Citadel keeps buried for good reason. not to suppress the truth, as some claim, but to protect the world from dangerous ideas. Dangerous how? Because men do foolish things when they believe they can master powers beyond their understanding. Walgrave moved toward the door, then paused. Valyria thought itself eternal. The dragonlords believed their magic and their might had conquered the very earth. They were wrong, and we're still living in the ruins of their era. He left, and Marwyn sat alone with his transcription and the weight of the old man's words. But he did not stop translating. 3 weeks after finding the scroll, Marwyn returned to the vaults one final time. He'd copied what he could, piecing together fragments into a narrative that both fascinated and disturbed him. Enis Beleris's journal painted a picture of an empire in its glory, blind to the warnings that should have been obvious. Tremors, strange sounds from deep places, slaves whispering of old evils awakened, and the dragonlords, in their pride, dismissing it all. He needed to know how it ended. The box sat where he'd left it, tucked behind a crate of tax records from the reign of Aegon the Unworthy. He reached for it, then froze. Someone had moved it, not far, just a hand's breadth to the left. But Marwyn had placed it with care, aligning the corner with a water stain on the shelf. Now it sat askew. His skin prickled. He looked around the vault, but saw nothing save shadows and the endless ranks of forgotten knowledge. Yet he felt watched, though by what or whom he could not say. He opened the box. The scroll was intact, but something else lay atop it that had not been there before. A single black feather. Raven's feather, perhaps, though it seemed too dark, as if it drank the lamplight. Beneath it, a scrap of parchment in fresh ink, the hand unfamiliar. The Citadel has kept these secrets for 4 centuries. Ask yourself why before you proceed. Marwyn's hand shook as he lifted the warning aside and examined the scroll. The final pages, the ones he had not yet read, beckoned. He unrolled them carefully, squinting at the water-damaged text. Year 12 before the Doom. The prophecies have begun, though few listen. A dreamer in House Targaryen speaks of fire-consuming fire, of the price of hubris paid in full. Lord Drakon laughs and calls it the ravings of a mad girl. But others have begun to move their wealth to Dragonstone, to Lys, to distant Volantis. They do not speak of it openly, but I see it in the ledgers. The wise are leaving, though they would not call themselves cowards. The handwriting grew more erratic in the following entries, the dates closer together. The ground shakes nightly now. Something is waking beneath us. I know this, though I cannot say how. The 14 meet in closed council, but word leaks out. They delve deeper still, seeking the source of the oldest fires, the first flames that gave our people power. They believe they can control it, bind it, use it to ensure our dominance lasts forever. Maester Indros has fled. I think him wise. And finally, in a hand so hurried, the words were barely legible. I'm leaving on the morrow, taking what family will come. Lord Drakon calls me faithless, but I see what he will not. We have gone too deep, burned too hot, bound too much. The flames themselves are sick, burning colors no fire should burn. And in the night, I hear. The entry ended mid-sentence. Whether the rest was lost to fire or simply never written, Marwyn could not tell. He sat back, his heart hammering. The doom had come shortly after, destroying the freehold in a single cataclysm. Whole mountains exploding, the ground itself shattering, the smoking sea born in an instant. 400 years later, it remained deadly, haunted by stone men, and worse. Strange word there. He tapped one of Marwyn's transcriptions. That's not classical Valyrian. That's older. Before the freehold codified the high speech. His eyes sharpened, and for a moment, Marwyn glimpsed the brilliant scholar Walgrave had once been. Where did you find this? The vaults. It wasn't a question. You've been in the restricted vaults, haven't you? Found something old Theobald told you to leave alone. There was no point in lying. Yes. Archmeister Walgrave was quiet for a long moment. Then he settled into a chair with a sigh, his moment of clarity fading like mist. Knowledge is a burden, boy. The more you know, the heavier the load. I've spent 60 years filling my head with facts and histories and lore. And you know what it's brought me. Sleep troubled by nightmares of things I can't quite remember and can't quite forget. I don't understand. Archmaster, no. You wouldn't. Walgrave's hand trembled slightly as he returned the parchment. You're like your uncle was, like I was once. You think knowledge is a treasure to be won. You don't yet understand it can also be a curse. He stood slowly, joints creaking. There are some things the Citadel keeps buried for good reason. Not to suppress the truth, as some claim, but to protect the world from dangerous ideas. Dangerous how? Because men do foolish things when they believe they can master powers beyond their understanding. Walgrave moved toward the door, then paused. Valyria thought itself eternal. The dragonlords believed their magic and their might had conquered the very earth. They were wrong, and we're still living in the ruins of their era. He left, and Marwyn sat alone with his transcription and the weight of the old man's words. But he did not stop translating. 3 weeks after finding the scroll, Marwyn returned to the vaults one final time. He'd copied what he could, piecing together fragments into a narrative that both fascinated and disturbed him. Enis Beleris's journal painted a picture of an empire in its glory, blind to the warnings that should have been obvious. Tremors, strange sounds from deep places, slaves whispering of old evils awakened, and the dragonlords, in their pride, dismissing it all. He needed to know how it ended. The box sat where he'd left it, tucked behind a crate of tax records from the reign of Aegon the Unworthy. He reached for it, then froze. Someone had moved it. Not far, just a hand's breadth to the left. But Marwyn had placed it with care, aligning the corner with a water stain on the shelf. Now it sat askew. His skin prickled. He looked around the vault, but saw nothing save shadows and the endless ranks of forgotten knowledge. Yet he felt watched, though by what or whom he could not say. He opened the box. The scroll was intact, but something else lay atop it that had not been there before. A single black feather. Raven's feather, perhaps, though it seemed too dark, as if it drank the lamplight. Beneath it, a scrap of parchment in fresh ink, the hand unfamiliar. The Citadel has kept these secrets for 4 centuries. Ask yourself why before you proceed. Marwyn's hand shook as he lifted the warning aside and examined the scroll. The final pages, the ones he had not yet read, beckoned. He unrolled them carefully, squinting at the water-damaged text. Year 12 before the Doom. The prophecies have begun, though few listen. A dreamer in House Targaryen speaks of fire-consuming fire, of the price of hubris paid in full. Lord Draken laughs and calls it the ravings of a mad girl. But others have begun to move their wealth to Dragonstone, to Lys, to distant Volantis. They do not speak of it openly, but I see it in the ledgers. The wise are leaving, though they would not call themselves cowards. The handwriting grew more erratic in the following entries, the dates closer together. The ground shakes nightly now. Something is waking beneath us. I know this, though I cannot say how. The 14 meet in closed council, but word leaks out. They delve deeper still, seeking the source of the oldest fires, the first flames that gave our people power. They believe they can control it, bind it, use it to ensure our dominance lasts forever. Maester Indros has fled. I think him wise. And finally, in a hand so hurried, the words were barely legible. I'm leaving on the morrow, taking what family will come. Lord Dracon calls me faithless, but I see what he will not. We have gone too deep, burned too hot, bound too much. The flames themselves are sick, burning colors no fire should burn. And in the night, I hear. The entry ended mid-sentence. Whether the rest was lost to fire or simply never written, Marwyn could not tell. He sat back, his heart hammering. The doom had come shortly after, destroying the freehold in a single cataclysm. Whole mountains exploding, the ground itself shattering, the smoking sea born in an instant. 400 years later, it remained deadly, haunted by stone men and worse things. And if Ennis was right, if the Valyrians had awakened something, delved too deep in their hunger for power, Marwyn gathered his notes and the scroll, wrapping both carefully. He would need to think about what to do with this knowledge. The citadel would likely demand he surrender it, lock it away again. But with dragons returned to the world, with whispers of magic stirring in distant lands, could they afford to ignore the warnings of history? As he climbed the stairs back to his cell, a raven cried somewhere in the darkness above, and Marwyn found himself wondering if the sound was warning or lament. The dawn would bring decisions. For now, he had only questions and a weight of knowledge that felt heavier with each step. The dragon roads gleamed like rivers of black glass beneath the morning sun. Aenys stood on the balcony of his family's manse, watching the traffic flow along the great causeway that connected the city proper to the harbour districts. Slave-born litters carried nobles draped in silk, dyed with colours that had no names in the common tongue. Merchants from Volantis and Lys guided wagons laden with tribute, Giscari amber, Sonori furs, jade from Yitai, and above it all, dragons wheeled through the sky like fragments of living flame. His dragon was among them, Morgax, a she-dragon with scales the colour of old bronze. She was young yet, barely large enough to bear a rider, but she was his. Bound to him in the ancient ritual when he'd reached his 16th year, her blood mingling with his in the black glass chalice. Every dragonlord of Valyria underwent the binding. It was what separated them from the sheep peoples, from the lesser families, from even the freedmen who served the freehold with distinction, but would never know the glory of flight. Wool gathering again, cousin? Aenys turned to find Denix leaning against the archway, a cup of wine already in hand, though the sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks. His cousin was 3 years his elder and fond of reminding him of it. The Beleris family was ancient and proud, but they were not among the 14, the true dragonlord families who ruled the freehold from their great pyramids. They were what his father called the 40 families. Old blood, yes, but ever in the shadow of their betters. Merely observing, Aenys said, "Father wishes me to attend the gathering at House Caleris this evening. I should know what cargo arrives if I'm to speak intelligently about trade." Denix snorted. You'll speak intelligently about whatever Lord Caleris tells you to speak about, and you'll thank him for the privilege. He took a long drink. That's our lot, cousin. We serve the 14, manage their mines and their trades, and in exchange they allow us our little manses and our small dragons and the illusion that we matter. We do matter. The freehold couldn't function without us doing the work while they reap the glory. Denix's smile was bitter. Yes, quite right. But don't mistake necessity for respect. My father spent 40 years overseeing the silver mines beneath the 7th flame. When he died, Lord Meager sent a freedman to deliver his condolences. A freedman, Ennis. Not even a blood letter. Ennis had no answer for that. The slight had been spoken of in whispers throughout the Balearis manse, but none dared voice it loudly. One did not criticize the 14, not if one wished to keep one's position. Come, Danik said, pushing off from the archway. If you must attend this gathering, at least know what to expect. I've been to a dozen such affairs. They're all the same, beautiful, boring, and ultimately pointless. The manse of House Caleris sat on a promontory overlooking the 5th flame, one of the great volcanoes that ringed the city. The building itself was a marvel, black stone fused with dragon bone in patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. Slave-worked forges beneath the manse fed heat through channels in the walls, keeping the interior pleasantly warm, even in the coldest months, though Valyria knew few cold months. The 14 flames burned eternally, and their heat kept the peninsula mild year-round. Ennis had dressed carefully for the occasion, in a tunic of deep crimson with embroidered dragons worked in silver thread. His family's sigil, a bronze dragon on a black field, was pinned to his shoulder with a brooch of Valyrian steel. It was old steel, forged by his great-grandfather when the family had been wealthier. Now such things were heirlooms, too precious to risk at the forges. The gathering hall was already full when they arrived. Nobles from a dozen families clustered in groups, their conversations a low murmur beneath the soaring ceiling. Slaves moved among them with trays of wine and delicacies, lamprey pie, honeyed figs, jellied eggs in aspic. The slaves were all beautiful, Ennis noted, chosen for their appearance as much as their service. That was the way of the freehold. Everything must be beautiful, even servitude. Ennis Baliris. He turned to find a woman regarding him with cool appraisal. She was perhaps 10 years his senior, with the silver gold hair and purple eyes that marked pure Valyrian blood. Her gown was cut in the style favored by the dragonlord families, leaving one shoulder bare, cinched with a belt of worked gold at the waist. She wore the 3-headed dragon brooch of House Targaryen. Lady Valina, he said, bowing. I did not know House Targaryen would be represented tonight. My lord husband is in Dragonstone, settling some matter of accounts. I came in his stead. She accepted a cup of wine from a passing slave without looking at the boy. Your family serves House Targaryen in the mining operations, do they not? We manage the eastern galleries beneath the 3rd flame, my lady. On behalf of Lord Aerion Targaryen, yes. And how do you find the work? It was a test, Ennis realized. The wrong answer here could cost his family their position. Challenging, my lady, but rewarding. The veins run deep, and the metal we extract fuels the greatest forges in the world. Pretty words. Belena's smile was slight, but I asked how you find the work, not how you would describe it to impress a dragonlord's wife. Enis hesitated. Around them, conversations continued, a backdrop of courtly pleasantries and political maneuvering. But Valyria Targaryen was watching him with an intensity that suggested his answer mattered more than he understood. "The work is difficult," he said, finally. "The slaves fear the deep galleries. Productivity has fallen in recent months, despite increased incentives. And there have been incidents. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Be specific, collapses. More than usual. We've lost slaves." And he hesitated again, then decided truth was safer than evasion. "And there are sounds from below. The slaves speak of them, though they fall silent when questioned too directly." "What sort of sounds?" "Like stone grinding against stone, but deeper, almost like he struggled for words. Like breathing, my lady, though I know that sounds mad." Valyria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "And what do your overseers say of this? That slaves are superstitious and prone to fancy. That the sounds are merely the mountains settling as we dig. That there is no cause for concern, and you believe them." Aenys met her gaze. "I believe they wish to believe themselves, my lady. But no, I do not think they truly believe it." Something shifted in Valyria's expression. Approval, perhaps, or recognition. "You're more perceptive than most men your age, Enis Beleris. That may serve you well, or it may make your life considerably more difficult." Before he could respond, a deep chime rang through the hall. 3 beats, sonorous and commanding. The conversations died at once. All eyes turned to the dais at the hall's far end, where Lord Caleris had appeared. He was old, easily 70, but he stood straight-backed and proud. His dragon, they said, was nearly 200 years old, vast as a ship and black as midnight. The dragonlord families prided themselves on their longevity, though Enis had heard whispers that it came at a cost. Blood magic, some said. Sacrifices made in the deep places beneath the flames. But such things were not spoken of openly. "Welcome, honored families," Caleris said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "We gather in celebration of the freehold's glory and to discuss matters that concern us all." The speech that followed was the usual fare. Praise for Valyria's might, assurances of the freehold's eternal dominance, warnings about the lesser peoples who envied their power. Enis had heard such speeches before. They were as much a part of Valyrian life as dragons and blood magic. But then Caleris said something that made Enis pay closer attention. "There are those who would counsel caution," the dragonlord said, his tone dismissive. "Who suggest we have delved deep enough that further mining risks instability. To them, I say, this Valyria has stood for 5,000 years. The 14 flames have burned since before the first dragon was bound. We are eternal because we are strong. Because we take what we need and bend the very earth to our will. That is the way of the dragonlords, and it shall ever be thus." Polite applause rippled through the hall. But Aenys noticed that not everyone joined in. Valyria Targaryen stood silent, her expression unreadable, and near the hall's entrance, an old man in a maester's robes, not a citadel maester, but one of the freehold's learned men, watched with eyes that seemed infinitely sad. The gathering continued for hours after that. Wine flowed freely, and conversations grew louder as the evening progressed. Enis found himself drawn into discussions of mining quotas, metal quality, and the endless competition between families for favor with the 14. It was all terribly dull, and he found his mind wandering. He thought of the sounds from below, the way the slaves' eyes went wide when they spoke of the deep galleries. The tremor he'd felt last week, subtle but unmistakable, that had sent dust sifting down from the ceiling of his office. And he thought of Valyna Targaryen's question, "And you believe them?" Near midnight, Enos found himself on one of the exterior balconies, grateful for the cool air. The fifth flame glowed in the distance, a mountain of fire reflected in the waters of the bay. Dragons circled above it. Always there were dragons above the flames, drawn to the heat and the ancient magic that dwelt within. Beautiful, isn't it? He turned to find the old Meister from earlier standing beside him. Up close, the man's face was a map of wrinkles, his eyes a pale grey that seemed to see more than they should. "It is, Master?" "Indros. I serve House Calaris, though serve might be too grand a word. Mostly I tend their library and keep records they never read." He gazed out at the flame. "I have studied the Freehold's history for 40 years, boy. Do you know what I have learned? That we are the greatest civilization the world has ever known." Ennis said it without irony. It was simply truth, stated as fact. Indros smiled, but there was no humor in it. That every civilization believes itself eternal until the moment it falls. The Giscari thought themselves invincible. The Rhoynar believed their water magic would protect them forever. The first men of Westeros imagined they would rule those lands until the end of days. All of them fell. All of them are dust. The Freehold is not like them. We have dragons. We have magic that you do not truly understand. Indros's voice was gentle, but firm. "Tell me, boy, do you know why the 14 flames burn? Why they have burned for 5,000 years without ceasing?" Enos frowned. "Because they are volcanoes, mountains of fire. They have always burned. They were not always burning. I have found texts, fragments, old beyond old, that speak of a time before the flames, when this peninsula was cold stone and dark earth like any other land." Indros turned to look at him directly. "The Freehold did not find the fire here. We brought it, or rather, we woke it." A chill ran down Enos's spine, despite the warm night. "What do you mean?" "The first dragonlords, the ones who founded Valyria, they dug deep into these mountains, deeper than we dig now, and they found something old, something that had slept in the earth since before men walked. They bound it with blood magic and forged their empire on its flames." The old man's hands trembled slightly. "But bindings can weaken, boy, and things that sleep can wake. You speak of myths and legends. I speak of history that has been forgotten because it was too terrible to remember." Indros pulled a small object from his robes, a piece of black stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at. "This was found last week in the deep galleries beneath the third flame, the same galleries you oversee. The slaves who found it refused to touch it. They said it was from before. When I asked them before what, they could not answer, or would not." Enos took the stone carefully. It was cold, far colder than stone had any right to be on a warm Valyrian night. The carvings seemed to writhe in the darkness, though he knew that was impossible. "What is it?" "Proof that we are not the first to build here. That others came before, in ages so distant even their names are lost. And proof that they left things behind, things that should not be disturbed." Indros took the stone back. "Lord Calaris ordered all such artifacts destroyed. He said they were primitive carvings, meaningless decorations from whatever savages lived here before we brought civilization. But I think he is afraid. I think he knows somewhere deep in his heart that we are playing with forces we do not comprehend. If you believe this, why not speak out? Warn the 14. The old man laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. I have tried, boy. For 10 years I have tried. They do not listen. They cannot afford to listen, because listening would mean admitting that their power has limits, that there are things even dragonlords cannot control. He placed a hand on Ennis's shoulder. You are young. You have decades ahead of you. Take my advice. When the signs become too clear to ignore, when the earth itself begins to rebel, do not stay. Run. Take your family and run as far as the world allows. Because when Valyria falls, and it will fall, nothing will survive. Before Ennis could respond, voices called from within. The gathering was breaking up, guests departing for their manses and estates. Indros melted back into the shadows, leaving Ennis alone with his thoughts and a creeping sense of dread he could not entirely dismiss. He flew home on Morgax as dawn broke over the freehold. Below him, the city gleamed black stone and red dragonbone, silver spires and golden domes. The 14 flames smoked peacefully on the horizon, as they had for 5,000 years. Eternal, Lord Caleris had said. Eternal because they were strong. But as Ennis guided his dragon over the eastern districts, he noticed something he'd never quite registered before. The city's foundations, the oldest parts, down where the ancient builders had first raised walls, were made of the same black stone as the carved artifact Indros had shown him. Stone that predated the freehold by uncounted ages. They had built their glory atop ruins, atop something older. And in the deep places beneath the third flame, where slaves whispered and strange sounds echoed, something was stirring. Ennis made a decision then, one that would shape all his days to come. He would keep a journal, record what he saw, what he learned, what others dismissed. Perhaps it would amount to nothing. The foolish fears of a minor noble with too much imagination. Or perhaps someday, someone would read his words and understand the warning. We are not as eternal as we believe, he would write that night. And the price of hubris is always paid in full. 14 years had passed since the gathering at House Caleris, and Ennis had learned that age brought responsibilities more readily than wisdom. He stood now in the administrative offices overlooking the eastern galleries of the Third Flame, reviewing reports that grew more troubling with each passing month. The chamber was carved from the mountain itself, its walls smooth black stone, warmed by channels of heated air from the forges below. Through the narrow window, he could see the slave columns emerging from the mine shafts. Hundreds of men and women, their bodies covered in rock dust, moving with the exhausted shuffle of those who had spent 12 hours in darkness. His father had died 6 years ago, carried off by a fever that the healers could not cure. The position of overseer had fallen to Ennis, along with the weight of managing 300 slaves, 24 freedmen's supervisors, and the endless demands of a House Targaryen for more ore, better quality, faster extraction. The numbers are worse this month. Ennis looked up to find Magar, his chief overseer, standing in the doorway. The man was Giscari by birth, captured as a boy and eventually freed for loyal service. He was perhaps 50 now, his face weathered and hard as the stone he spent his life supervising. How much worse? Production down another 8%. And we lost 11 slaves in the past week. 11? Enos set down his quill. What happened? 5 to cave-ins. 3 to some kind of sickness. They developed black boils on their skin and died within hours. The healers have never seen anything like it. And 3, Margar hesitated. 3 simply disappeared. Disappeared? In the mines? In the deep galleries. The new shaft Lord Aerion ordered dug last year, the one that goes down past the old workings. The slaves say there are places down there where the rock feels wrong, where sounds echo strangely, where... He stopped, looking uncomfortable. Where what, Mygar? Speak plainly. Where they hear things that aren't there, my lord. Voices in languages no living tongue knows. Breathing sounds from stone. And sometimes they see lights in the deepest tunnels. Green lights, they say, that move like living things. Enos felt a chill despite the chamber's warmth. He'd heard such reports before, dismissed them as superstition and slave fancy. But the numbers didn't lie. Production falling, slaves dying or vanishing, and Lord Aerion Targaryen growing impatient for explanations. Have you investigated these claims? I sent 2 of my best men down to the deep galleries 3 days ago. Free men, not slaves. Men I trust. Margar's jaw tightened. Only one came back. He won't speak of what happened, just sits in the barracks, staring at nothing. When I ask him what he saw, he makes a sign against evil and walks away. Enos pushed back from his desk and moved to the window. The sun was setting behind the flames, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Beautiful, eternal, just as the dragonlords proclaimed in their speeches and songs. But beauty could hide rot, and eternity was a word men used when they refused to imagine endings. I'll go down myself, he said finally. My lord, I don't think... I'll go down myself, Enos repeated, turning to face his overseer. Tomorrow morning, have a dozen men prepared, freedmen, not slaves. Bring lamps and rope, and Magar. He held the man's gaze. Bring weapons as well. Weapons? My lord, there's nothing down there but rock and... Humour me. They descended at dawn when the day shift was just beginning and the night workers were emerging like ghosts from the earth. Enos had dressed practically. Rough wool tunic, leather breeches, heavy boots. No noble finery down here. The mines didn't care about bloodlines or dragon bonds. The first levels were familiar territory. He'd walked them dozens of times over the years, inspecting operations and settling disputes. The air was thick with dust and the smell of sweat, but torches lit the passages and wooden supports held back the weight of the mountain. Slaves worked in teams, chipping at the rock face with picks and hammers, filling baskets that were hauled up to the surface. Hard work, brutal work, but comprehensible. It was only when they passed the old workings and descended to the new shaft that things began to feel different. The air grew colder, not the pleasant cool of deep earth, but a bone-deep chill that made Enos's breath mist despite the proximity to the flames' heat. The rock here was darker too, not the familiar black basalt of Valyrian construction, but something older, smoother, almost oily to the touch. This is where the cave-ins have been most frequent, Mygar said, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow passage. We shore up the tunnels, but the supports fail. The rock just breaks, as if something is pushing from below. They passed a work crew reinforcing a collapsed section. The slaves wouldn't meet Enos's eyes. They worked in silence, their movements quick and fearful, and when one of them accidentally brushed against the exposed rock face, he jerked back as if burned. "How deep does this shaft go?" Aenys asked. "Near on 400 feet below the old workings, maybe 500 feet total from the surface." Mygar paused at a junction where the passage split in 3 directions. "The deepest gallery is this way, the one where the 3 slaves vanished." They took the rightmost passage. The torches seemed to burn dimmer here, their light swallowed by the darkness rather than the pushing it back. Aenys found his hand drifting to the blade at his belt, a short sword of Valyrian steel, more ornament than weapon, but sharp enough to draw blood if needed. The passage opened into a larger chamber, perhaps 30 feet across. The walls here were not hewn by human hands. They were too smooth, too perfectly curved, marked with the same strange carvings Maester Indros had shown him all those years ago. Symbols that hurt to look at, geometries that seemed wrong, as if they existed in more dimensions than the eye could perceive. "Gods," one of the freedmen whispered. "What is this place?" "We didn't dig this," Mygar said, moving his torch across the walls. "We broke through into it about 6 months ago. Lord Aerion ordered us to expand the mining operations, to follow a new vein. The slaves opened a hole in the rock, and this was behind it, just waiting." Aenys approached the nearest wall and ran his fingers across the carvings. The stone was cold enough to numb his fingertips, and beneath his touch, he felt something, a vibration so faint it might have been imagination, like a heartbeat, slow and deep, pulsing through the mountain. "The missing slaves," he said. "Where were they working?" "There." Mygar pointed to a passage on the chamber's far side, narrower than the others, descending at a steep angle. "We found their tools and lamps, but no bodies, no blood, just gone." Aenys stared into that dark throat of stone. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to seal this chamber and never return. But he was overseer of these mines. These people, slave and free alike, were his responsibility. He had to know. "Stay here," he told the others. "If I am not back in an hour, seal the passage and report to Lord Aerion." "My lord, you can't—" But Aenys was already moving toward the passage, his torch held high, his sword loose in its sheath. The descent was treacherous. The floor was slick with something that wasn't quite water, thicker, more viscous, with a faint greenish tinge that glowed in the torchlight. The walls pressed close, and the air grew so cold that his breath came in white clouds. And there were sounds, not the sounds of rocks settling or water dripping. These were different. Whispers, perhaps, though in no language he'd ever heard. And beneath them, that slow, rhythmic pulse, like breathing, like a heart beating in the deeps of the earth. He'd gone perhaps 200 feet when he found the first body. It was one of the missing slaves, a Sonori man who'd been strong and healthy when Aenys had last seen him. Now he lay crumpled against the passage wall, his skin grey as ash. But it was his face that made Aenys's stomach turn. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was stretched in a scream that had never found voice. And across his skin, spreading like cracks in old pottery, were lines of faint green light. Aenys knelt beside the body, forcing himself to look closer. The light seemed to pulse in time with that deep heartbeat he felt through the stone. And where the lines intersected, the flesh had begun to change, to crystallize almost. taking on the texture of the strange rocks surrounding them. A sound echoed from deeper in the passage. Not a whisper this time. Something more substantial. The scrape of stone on stone, but with a rhythm to it, like footsteps. Aenys stood slowly, his hand tight on his sword hilt. "Who's there?" No answer. But the scraping grew closer. He should run. Every particle of sense told him to turn and flee back to the main chamber. But his feet remained rooted, watching the darkness beyond his torchlight. Something moved in the black. It was not human. He knew that immediately, though he couldn't have said how. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, moving with a liquid grace that no man possessed. And where it passed, the green light in the walls grew brighter, pulsing like diseased veins. "Show yourself," Aenys said, and was proud that his voice barely shook. The thing stepped into the edge of his torchlight. He would never be able to properly describe what he saw. His mind refused to hold the image, sliding away from it like water off oiled cloth. Tall, yes, perhaps 8 feet, perhaps more, covered in something that might have been stone, or might have been flesh, or might have been both. Arms too long, fingers too many, and a face that was more suggestion than reality. Hollows where eyes might have been, a mouth that opened and opened and opened, revealing depths that shouldn't exist in any living skull. It made a sound, not words, just a low vibration that Aenys felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the meat of his brain. And with that sound came understanding. Not knowledge, but a bone-deep certainty that what stood before him was old, older than Valyria, older than men, older than the world above. And they had woken it. The torch fell from Aenys's numb fingers. In the moment before it hit the ground, he saw more of them, shapes moving in the darkness beyond the first, a dozen or more, pressing closer. The green light pulsed brighter, and that slow heartbeat accelerated, faster and faster, like the mountain itself was waking. Then the torch hit stone and went out, and there was only darkness and the sound of breathing that came from everywhere and nowhere. Aenys ran. He didn't remember the climb back to the main chamber, didn't remember screaming for the others to flee, didn't remember the wild scramble up the passage toward the surface. His mind was a white blur of terror, his body moving on instinct alone. They emerged into the main workings to find chaos. The slaves were fleeing their posts, screaming in a dozen different tongues. The ground shook, a tremor strong enough to crack support beams and send rock dust sifting from the ceiling. And from below, from the deep places, came a sound like mountains grinding together. "Seal it," Aenys gasped to Margar. "Seal the shaft now. My lord, the equipment, now." They brought down the passage with sledgehammers and controlled collapse, tons of rock filling the shaft that led to the deep galleries. It took hours, and 3 more men died when a support beam gave way. But eventually it was done. The passage was blocked, and the sounds from below were muffled to a dull rumble. Aenys stood in the aftermath, his hands shaking, his mind still reeling from what he'd seen. "What was down there?" Margar asked quietly. "What did you see?" "Nothing," Aenys lied. "Rockfall, bad air. We'll dig elsewhere." But that night, in his private chambers, he wrote the truth in his journal, wrote it in careful detail, though his hand shook and his mind screamed to forget. Because someone had to remember. Someone had to know. "We are not the first to dig in these mountains," he wrote. "And what we have woken does not wish us well. I have seen what sleeps beneath the flames, and I fear, I know, that we cannot contain it. The 14 speak of eternity, but I have looked into the face of what came before, and I understand now that we are but children playing with forces we cannot comprehend. Lord Draken will not listen. I brought my report to him this morning, told him of the deaths and the cave-ins, and recommended we abandon the deep workings entirely. He called me a coward and a fool. The freehold does not retreat before shadows, he said. We are dragonlords. The earth itself bows to our will, but I have seen what dwells in that earth, and it does not bow. It sleeps, yes, but our digging has disturbed that sleep, and when it wakes fully, when the bindings our ancestors placed upon it finally fail, I fear not even dragons will save us. He set down his quill and stared at the words. They looked like madness, like the ravings of a man whose mind had broken in the dark. Perhaps they were. Perhaps he had imagined it all, the shapes, the lights, the breathing stone. But his hands still shook. And deep in the night, when the city was silent, he could still hear that slow heartbeat pulsing through the mountain. The earth was waking, and all of Valyria's glory, all their dragons and magic and pride, would not be enough to stop what they had begun. The year 50, before the Doom, the tremors had become a fact of life in Valyria, as common as the morning mist that rose from the bay or the dragons that wheeled eternally above the flames. Most days brought at least one, a subtle shiver in the stone, cups rattling on tables, dust sifting from ceiling beams. The people had grown accustomed to them. The 14 assured everyone that such things were natural, merely the breath of the mountains that had sustained their empire for millennia. Enys knew better. He stood in the council chamber of House Baleris, watching his cousin Denix pace like a caged animal. The years had not been kind to Denix. His hair had gone prematurely silver, and lines of worry carved deep around his eyes. He'd taken over management of the Western galleries when his father died, and the burden had aged him beyond his years. 3 more collapses this month, Denix said, his voice tight with frustration. 17 slaves dead, and the 14 demand we increase production by another 20%. 20%, when we can barely maintain current levels. Have you taken your concerns to Lord Maegor? Enys asked, though he already knew the answer. Of course I have. He told me the same thing they always tell us, that we're being overcautious, that the freehold's needs must come first, that our ancestors dug deeper and had no such troubles. Denix stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the table. But our ancestors didn't dig as deep as we're digging now. They didn't push past the old workings into whatever lies beneath. Enys said nothing. He told no one what he'd seen in the deep gallery 30 years ago, not even Denix. How could he? Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself on days when the sun shone bright and dragons flew overhead and everything seemed eternal and unchanging. But on days like this, when the ground trembled and he heard reports of strange sicknesses among the miners, of tools that corroded overnight in certain tunnels, of slaves who spoke of whispers in the dark, on those days he remembered, and the memory filled him with a dread that no amount of wine or company could dispel. There's something else, Denix said quietly. Something I haven't reported to the 14. What is it? We broke through into an old chamber last week. Pre-Valyrian, like the one you found years ago. The slaves refused to enter, said the air was wrong, that it made their heads hurt and their vision blur. So I sent in 2 freedmen to investigate. He paused. They found markings on the walls, not just carvings, actual writing, in a language none of our scholars can read. Did you bring samples? Better. I brought an artist to sketch them. Denix produced a rolled parchment and spread it on the table. Ennis studied the drawings. The symbols were similar to those he'd seen before, but more elaborate, complex spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and twist even in two-dimensional representation. And among them, repeated again and again, was a symbol that made his breath catch. A circle with 14 points radiating outward, each point ending in a flame. 14, he murmured. Like the 14 flames, like the 14 families. Denix's finger traced the symbol. I showed this to Meister Indros. He's ancient now, barely leaves his library, but his mind is still sharp. He looked at these drawings for an hour, then told me something I wish I could unhear. What did he say? That this symbol predates the freehold by thousands of years, that whoever carved it knew about the flames before we ever came here, and that the writing, as near as he can translate, is a warning. Denix's voice dropped to barely a whisper. It says, the sleeping fire must not wake. The 14 bindings must hold. Should they break, the world burns. The chamber was silent, save for the distant rumble of the forges and the ever-present whisper of heated air through the walls. Outside, a dragon roared, whether in triumph or warning. Ennis could not tell. We need to stow, he said finally. Stop the deep mining. Seal the chambers we've opened. Before we anger forces we don't understand. Before we wake something that should stay sleeping. Denix laughed, but there was no humor in it. You sound like the doomsayers who gather in the lower districts, preaching that Valyria will fall. The 14 have already arrested 3 of them for spreading unrest. Perhaps the 14 are afraid the doomsayers are right. Then they're fools. You can't arrest the truth. Denix rolled up the parchment. I'm taking this to the council of the 40 families. Let them decide what to do with it. They'll dismiss it. They always do, perhaps. But I have to try. The year 38. Before the doom, the council of the 40 families met in a grand hall carved from a single piece of black stone, its ceiling supported by pillars shaped like coiled dragons. Ennis attended as representative of House Baleris, his father's seat having passed to him upon Denix's death 5 years prior. His cousin had died in a mining accident, crushed when a gallery collapsed without warning, burying him and 16 others beneath tons of rock. The official report said it was structural failure, but Ennis had been to the site. He'd seen the supports, still intact, twisted and bent as if by enormous pressure from below. He'd seen the expressions on the recovered corpses' faces, not the peaceful unconsciousness of men killed instantly, but the wide-eyed terror of those who'd seen something before the darkness took them. Now he sat among the other lesser dragonlord families, listening to Lord Harrion of House Volteos make the same arguments Denix had made 12 years ago. Production has fallen across all mining operations, Harrion was saying, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. Not from lack of effort, but from conditions in the deep workings. Collapses are occurring weekly now. Strange illnesses afflict the miners. Equipment fails for no discernible reason. And the slaves. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. The slaves are becoming unmanageable. They speak of prophecies and curses. Some have attempted to flee, preferring death to another day in the mines. Then beat them harder, said Lady Tessera of a house coheres from her seat among the highest families. We are too soft with our slaves. They forget their place. With respect, my lady, fear of the lash is one thing. What they fear in the mines is something else entirely. Superstition and foolishness, said Lord Mager, waving a dismissive hand. Slaves are ignorant creatures, prone to fancy. We cannot allow their fears to dictate policy. But it's not just the slaves, Harry pressed. Free men have reported the same phenomena. Overseers, maesters, even some of your own appointed administrators. His eyes found Aenys across the chamber. Lord Beleris, you've managed mining operations for decades. Tell the council what you've witnessed. All eyes turned to Aenys. He felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. Nobles and dragonlords, holders of ancient power, accustomed to having the world bend to their will. What could he say that they would believe? What truth could penetrate their armor of pride and certainty? He stood slowly. I have witnessed, he said carefully, phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Tunnels that grow colder the deeper we dig, even as we approach the heart of the flames. Stone that seems to resist our tools more with each passing year. And sounds. He paused. Sounds from below that no natural process can account for. What sort of sounds? This from Lord Aegon of House Targaryen, watching him with keen intelligence from the raised dais where the most powerful families sat. Like breathing, Aenys said, like something vast and slow, stirring in its sleep. The chamber erupted in laughter, not all of it, but enough. Lady Tessera's voice cut through the noise. Breathing stone. Perhaps next you'll tell us the mountains have grown eyes and watch us as we work. I tell you only what I and dozens of others have witnessed, my lady. Whether you choose to believe it is your concern. But I urge caution. We are delving into places our ancestors deliberately left sealed. Perhaps they had good reason. Our ancestors were more cautious than we are bold, Lord Mager said, rising from his seat. That is why they built an empire, but did not expand it. Why they established colonies, but did not conquer the world. We are the heirs of their power, yes, but we need not be bound by their fears. He swept his gaze across the assembly. Valyria stands supreme because we take what we need, because we bend the very elements to our purpose. The earth, the fire, even the dragons themselves, all serve us. Shall we cower before superstition and slave talk? Shall we abandon the source of our wealth and might because mines are dangerous and men die in them, the chamber filled with voices raised in support? Aenys sat down slowly, knowing the battle was lost before it began. Lord Aegon Targaryen did not join the chorus of approval. He sat silent, his expression thoughtful, his fingers drumming slowly on the arm of his seat. When the noise died down, he spoke. Lord Mager makes a compelling argument, but I would ask this. What is the cost of continuing? Not in gold or slaves. Those can be replaced. I speak of the deeper cost. If there is truth to these reports, if we are disturbing something we do not understand, what price might we pay for our boldness? There is no price too high for maintaining Valyria's dominance, Mager replied. Would you have us grow weak? Allow lesser peoples to catch up to us? The freehold strength lies in our willingness to do what others will not. Strength, Aegon said quietly, and wisdom are not the same thing. But his voice was drowned out by the others. And when the vote was called, the decision was clear. Mining operations would not only continue, but expand. The 14 flames must be fed. The forges must burn. The empire must grow. Aenys left the chamber with a sick feeling in his stomach. He found Lord Aegon standing on a balcony overlooking the city, alone, staring out at the distant mountains. "You did not vote," Aenys said. "No. House Targaryen abstains when we believe neither course is wise." Aegon glanced at him. "You spoke bravely in there. Foolishly, perhaps, but bravely. I spoke the truth. Truth is a dangerous commodity in times of certainty." The Dragon Lord was quiet for a moment. "My daughter has dreams. She is young, barely 10, but her dreams are vivid. She sees fire consuming fire, stone melting like wax, dragons falling from the sky, their wings turned to ash." He smiled, but there was no joy in it. "I tell myself they are merely the nightmares of a sensitive child, but I have ordered preparations nonetheless. House Targaryen is establishing a permanent presence on Dragonstone, moving assets, consolidating power outside the peninsula. You believe something is coming? I believe that empires which forget their mortality tend to learn harsh lessons." Aegon turned to face him directly. "If your reports are accurate, if there is something beneath the flames that our digging has disturbed, then there may come a time when wisdom demands retreat rather than advance. When that time comes, Lord Valyris, I hope you will have the sense to flee." "And the 14? "The 14 will stay. Pride will demand it. They will remain until the last possible moment, certain that their power can overcome any threat." He laid a hand briefly on Aenys' shoulder. "Do not make their mistake. When the ground opens beneath you, only a fool waits to see how deep the chasm runs." The year 22. Before the Doom, a woman came to the city claiming to be a prophetess. She appeared first in the lower districts, preaching in the markets and squares. A red priestess, some said, serving the fire god R'hllor, whose worship was spreading from Ashai. Others claimed she was older than that, a practitioner of magics that predated even the Valyrians' mastery of fire and blood. Aenys heard of her from his steward, a freedman named Pero, who had family in the lower districts. "They say she speaks in tongues that weren't meant for human mouths," Pero reported, his face troubled, "and that when she prophesies, the flames in nearby hearths burn strange colors, green and blue and black." "What does she prophesy?" "Doom, an end to the freehold. She says the fires have been bound too long, that the price of binding must eventually be paid." Pero hesitated. "She says the 14 flames will turn on us, that everything we've built will be consumed in a single day of fire and ash." It was not the first such prophecy. Doomsayers had become common in recent years, perhaps because the signs were growing harder to ignore. The tremors came daily now. Strange lights were seen in the sky at night, auroras of sickly green that danced above the mountains. And there were stories, whispered in taverns and servants' quarters, of people who ventured too close to certain old mining sites and came back, changed, skin gone grey as stone, eyes that saw through you rather than at you, voices that spoke in harmonics no human throat should produce. The 14 had ordered such talk suppressed, but you cannot suppress truth forever. Aenys found himself drawn to hear the prophetess speak. He went disguised, in common clothes, his face hooded. The square where she preached was packed. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, from all stations of life. Not just slaves and freedmen, but nobles too, though they tried to hide their faces as he did. The woman stood on a raised platform, her form wrapped in crimson robes that seemed to move with their own wind. Her face was ageless. She might have been 30 or 300. When she spoke, her voice carried without effort, filling the square with a resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "You believe yourselves eternal," she said. "You believe your power has conquered death itself. But I tell you this, eternity is not yours to claim. It was stolen, bought with blood and sacrifice, bound with magics you no longer understand, and all debts must eventually be paid." "What do you know of our power?" someone shouted from the crowd. "You're just another mad woman seeing visions in smoke." The prophetess turned her gaze toward the voice, and Enis felt a chill despite the warm evening. Her eyes were wrong somehow, too bright, too knowing, as if they saw not just the man who'd spoken, but everything he'd ever been or would be. "I know," she said softly, though her voice still carried that beneath your feet the old ones stir, that the bindings your ancestors placed upon them grow weak, that with each shaft you sink, each gallery you carve, you loosen the chains that hold them sleeping. She raised her hands, and Enis could have sworn the air around her shimmered with heat. The 14 flames were not always flames. They were mountains, cold and dead until your forebears dug too deep and woke what should have remained buried. They bound it, yes, forced it into service, turned its power to their own ends. But binding and mastery are not the same thing, and what you have bound will not stay bound forever. Lies, another voice. Blasphemy against the freehold. Truth, the prophetess replied. Truth that your lords will not speak, because speaking it would mean admitting their power has limits. But the earth does not care for your pride. The old ones do not bow to dragonfire. And when the bindings fail, as fail they must, as fail they will, everything you have built will fall in a single day of ash and flame. The crowd stirred uneasily. Enis found his hand drifting to his chest, where his heart hammered like a caged bird. "When?" someone called. "When will this doom come?" The prophetess closed her eyes. For a long moment she was silent, and the square held its breath. Then she spoke, and her voice was different, older, harder, touched with something that might have been sorrow. "Soon, within a generation, you will see the signs. The ground will split, the sea will boil, the sky will burn colors never meant for mortal eyes. And in that day, those who are wise will flee. Those who remain will learn that all empires, no matter how mighty, are built on sand." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Enis, though he was certain she could not see his face beneath his hood. "Some of you will survive to carry the warning forward, to tell those who come after what hubris costs. Make certain they listen." That night, the City Watch arrested the prophetess on charges of spreading unrest and disturbing the peace. She went with them quietly, offering no resistance. 3 days later, they found her cell empty. The door was still locked. The guards swore no one had entered or left. But the woman was gone, vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The only thing left behind was a message, burned into the stone wall in letters that glowed faintly green in the darkness. "The fires remember, the year 12. Before the doom, Enis sat in his study, writing by lamplight. His hair had gone grey, his hands were knotted with age, and his back ached constantly from decades of work. But his mind remained sharp, and his memory of what he'd seen in the deep galleries, now 40 years past, had not faded. If anything, it had grown clearer. The reports on his desk spoke their own truth. Mining operations were failing across the peninsula, not from lack of effort, but from the sheer impossibility of the work. Tunnels collapsed faster than they could be dug. Equipment corroded within days rather than years. And the earth itself fought them now. Temperature fluctuations that made no sense, tremors strong enough to crack foundations, and always, those sounds from below. House Targaryen had completed its withdrawal to Dragonstone. Lord Aegon's daughter Daenerys, the one who dreamed, had convinced her family that staying meant death. They'd left quietly, moving wealth and people over the course of years until only a token presence remained in the capital. Other families had begun to follow. Not openly, that would mean admitting fear, but assets were being moved to Volantis, to Lys, to distant colonies where the ground did not shake and the air did not taste of stone and sulphur. The 14 maintained that all was well, that the freehold would stand forever. But Aenys had lived long enough to recognize denial when he saw it. He dipped his quill and wrote, "I am an old man now, and my time grows short. I have seen what lies beneath our glory, and I know, with the certainty that comes from looking into the face of the abyss, that we are doomed. Not today, perhaps not for another decade, but doomed nonetheless. We thought ourselves masters of fire and earth. We were wrong. We are children who found a weapon we did not forge and claimed it as our own. And like all children playing with forces beyond their understanding, we will pay the price. I am taking what family remains and departing for Volantis before the month ends. Let history judge me a coward. I would rather live as a coward than die as a fool." He set down his quill and stared at the words. Tomorrow he would make arrangements, sell what could be sold, abandon what could not, and flee while flight was still possible. Outside, the 14 flames burned bright against the night sky, beautiful, eternal. And beneath them, in the deep places where no light reached, something vast and ancient drew breath and waited for its chains to break. 10 days before, the ship was called Summer's Promise, a merchant galley out of Volantis with room for passengers willing to pay the exorbitant rates captains now charged for passage away from the peninsula. Aenys had booked space for himself, his wife Jaenara, their 2 children, and his sister's family. 8 souls in all, plus what possessions they could carry. It was not enough space. It would never be enough. You're certain you won't reconsider? Aenys turned to find his nephew Vaelor standing in the doorway of his study. The young man, barely 20, wore the bronze and black of House Baleris with pride, his hand resting on the pommel of an ornate sword that had been in the family for 3 generations. "There's nothing to reconsider," Aenys said, continuing to sort through his papers. Some would come with him, his journals, the most important records. The rest would stay, doomed to ash along with everything else. "We leave in 3 days when the Promise sails. Uncle, you're abandoning our house, our heritage, everything our ancestors built." "Our ancestors," Aenys said quietly, "built on a foundation they did not understand, and that foundation is crumbling. You speak of prophecies and slave talk. The 14 have assured us. The 14 are fools." The words came out harsher than Aenys intended. He softened his tone. "Vaelor, I have lived longer than you. I have seen things in the deep places that would steal the sleep from your eyes. I am not leaving because I'm afraid of shadows. I am leaving because I know, with absolute certainty, that to stay is to die. Then you would have our house die as cowards. Enos set down the parchment he'd been holding and looked his nephew in the eye. I would have our house live, even if living means leaving everything behind, even if it means being called cowards by those too proud or too blind to save themselves. He gestured to the papers scattered across his desk. Do you know what these are? Reports from every mining operation on the peninsula, all saying the same thing. The deep galleries are becoming impassable. The tremors grow stronger daily. Strange sounds echo from below. Not the sounds of settling rock, but something else. Something alive. Mines are dangerous. They always have been. Not like this. Enos pulled out a particular report, its edges singed as if it had been near flame. This is from the western galleries, the ones your father managed before he died. 3 days ago, workers broke through into a chamber that shouldn't exist. The air inside was cold enough to freeze their breath. And the walls... He paused, remembering the description that had made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in ice that burned to the touch. Ice Valor in the heart of a volcano, and carved into that ice were symbols, the same symbols we've been finding for decades, always deeper, always older. What did they say? The slaves who could read them, the ones from the old Giscari families who preserved their ancient lore, they said it was a warning. The sleepers wake, the bindings fail, fire will consume fire. Enos met his nephew's gaze. The workers fled, all of them, and when the overseers tried to go back to retrieve equipment, they found the passage sealed, not collapsed, sealed, as if the mountain itself had closed the wound. Valor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a dragon roared, one of the great beasts that lived atop the third flame, its call echoing across the city. Once, such sounds had filled Enos with pride. Now they only reminded him of how much would be lost. Even if you're right, Valor said finally, I cannot leave. Lord Draken has ordered all family members to remain. He says we must show unity, show strength. To leave would be seen as betrayal. Better a living traitor than a dead loyalist. You don't understand. My wife is with child. If I flee, if I'm branded a coward, what life would our child have? Better to stay. Better to trust that the 14 know what they're doing. Enos wanted to argue, wanted to grab his nephew by the shoulders and shake sense into him. But he saw the set of Valar's jaw, the pride in his eyes, and knew it would be useless. Pride, that most Valyrian of traits. Pride had built this empire, and pride would see it fall. Then I pray you survive, Enos said quietly. And if you do, remember that I tried to warn you. After Valor left, Enos returned to his packing. His hand shook as he wrapped his journals in oiled cloth, protecting them against salt spray and weather. These were his legacy now. Not estates or titles or family holdings, but words. A record of what had been and what would be lost. If he survived the crossing. If the ship made it to port before whatever was coming finally arrived. If. 3 days before. The tremor struck during the morning meal. It was stronger than any before it, strong enough to crack walls and shatter windows, to send dishes flying from tables and slaves screaming from their posts. Enos grabbed his daughter as a ceiling beam groaned overhead, pulling her beneath the heavy oak table as chunks of plaster rained down. The shaking lasted perhaps 30 seconds, an eternity and an instant all at once. When it finally stopped, the household was in chaos. Servants weeping, children crying, his wife Shannara pale and shaking, but trying to maintain composure. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely steady. "Not in 3 days. Now. The ship doesn't sail until. Then we find another ship, or we walk, but we cannot stay here." Her fingers dug into his arm. "Enis, I saw the sky while you were under the table. The clouds above the 14th flame, they were the wrong color. Green, like infected flesh. And the smoke," she shuddered. "It wasn't rising, it was falling, like the mountain was breathing in rather than out." Enis stood slowly, helping his daughter to her feet. Through the broken windows, he could see the city stirring like a disturbed anthill. People in the streets, pointing at the sky. Dragons circling in agitation. And yes, the smoke from the 14th flame was moving strangely, coiling and twisting in ways smoke should not move. "Pack only what you can carry," he told Shannara. "We leave within the hour." They reached the harbor to find it already mobbed. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people crowded the docks, all seeking the same thing: passage away from the peninsula. Any ship that could float was being boarded, captains charging prices that would have been criminal days ago, but now seemed merely prudent. The summer's promise was gone. Its captain had apparently decided not to wait, taking whatever passengers had already boarded and leaving the rest to their fate. Enis felt a moment of pure panic before forcing it down. Panic helped no one. There, his son Mela, 14 and sharp-eyed, pointed to a smaller vessel at the far end of the docks. "That merchant ship is taking on passengers." They fought their way through the crowd. Enis had brought gold, but so had everyone else. The ship's captain, a hard-faced woman from Lys, was demanding jewelry, Valyrian steel, anything of true value. "How much?" Enis asked when they finally reached her. She looked at his family, counting heads. "For 8, every piece of jewelry you're wearing, that sword at your hip, and..." Her eyes fixed on something around Shannara's neck. That pendant. It was a dragon carved from a single ruby, a wedding gift from Enis's father, worth more than gold, worth more than most of what they'd abandoned. Shannara pulled it off without hesitation and handed it over. "Cabin space is full," the captain said, pocketing the pendant. "You'll be in the hold with the cargo. We sail with the evening tide, whether the harbor's clear or not. Be aboard by sunset or be left behind." They stumbled aboard, finding space among crates and barrels in the dim cargo hold. Other families were already there, nobles and freedmen alike, reduced to the same desperate circumstance. Enis recognized Lord Harrion of House Viltheos, the man who'd spoken so passionately at the Council of 40 Families years ago. The Lord's fine clothes were torn and dirty, his face haggard. Baleris Harrion said something like relief in his voice. "You made it. Barely your family. My wife and younger son. The others." His voice cracked. "They stayed. Said I was being foolish. That the freehold would stand." There was nothing to say to that. Enis settled his family as comfortably as possible on sacks of grain, while outside, the chaos of the harbor continued. More tremors came as the afternoon wore on, smaller than the mornings, but frequent. Through the gaps in the deck boards above, he could see the sky darkening, though sunset was still hours away. The wrongness of it made his skin crawl. The day the doom came with the dawn. Enis had been awake for hours, unable to sleep in the close confines of the hold. The ship had sailed with the evening tide, laden so heavily it sat dangerously low in the water. Every inch of space was packed with refugees, in cabins, on deck, in the hold. The captain had taken on far more passengers than was safe, but no one complained. Better to risk drowning than certainly burn. They'd made perhaps 20 miles from the peninsula when the first explosion came. It sounded like the world breaking. Enis was thrown against a support beam as the ship heaved violently. Around him, people screamed. His wife grabbed the children, pulling them close as another explosion followed, then another. Through the gaps in the deck, he saw light, but wrong light, sickly green and blue mixed with red, bright enough to hurt the eyes. "Stay here," he shouted to Jaenara, then fought his way to the ladder, leading above deck. What he saw when he emerged made his mind struggle to process the information. The 14 flames were erupting, not one, not two, all of them, simultaneously. Mountains that had stood for millennia were exploding, their peaks blowing apart in gouts of fire and ash. But it was the color of the flames that made Aenys's blood freeze, not the red-orange of natural fire, but green and blue and black colors that hurt to look at, that seemed to burn not just matter, but space itself. And beneath the explosions, beneath the roar of shattering stone, he heard something else, a sound he'd heard once before, in a deep gallery 40-some years ago, like breathing, like something impossibly vast, drawing breath and screaming its rage at the world. "Gods preserve us," someone whispered beside him. Lord Harrion, his face slack with horror. The peninsula was breaking apart. Aenys watched. They all watched, frozen in terror, as the ground between the flames began to crack. Not small fissures, but massive rifts miles wide, opening like wounds in the earth. And from those wounds came not lava, but something else, something that moved. Shapes rose from the depths, vast and terrible, their forms impossible to comprehend, like the thing he'd seen in the deep gallery, but magnified 1,000-fold. The old ones, the things that had slept beneath Valyria since before time had meaning, woken at last, freed at last, and they were angry. "Row!" the captain was screaming. "Row, you fools! Get us away from here!" But there was nowhere to go that was truly away. The explosion was spreading, consuming the peninsula like a wave of annihilation. The city, beautiful Valyria with its black stone towers and dragon bone bridges, was simply gone, vaporized in an instant of heat beyond heat. The mountains collapsed inward, and the sea rushed in to fill the void, but even the water burned, boiling and steaming and turning to choking fog. The ash came next. It fell like black snow, thick and hot, covering everything. People on deck screamed as it touched their skin, burning through cloth and flesh. Aenys grabbed a tarp and pulled it over himself and several others, but he could still hear the screams of those who hadn't found cover. The ship lurched again. A wave, massive, unnatural, lifted them high and then dropped them into a trough. Water poured over the rails. The captain was shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of destruction behind them. Aenys risked a glance back at the peninsula. There was no peninsula anymore. Just fire, just ash, just the shapes moving through the flames. The old ones, dancing in the destruction, celebrating their freedom with a fury that would burn for generations. "The children," Jaenara's voice, desperate, from below. "Aenys, water's coming in." He scrambled back down to the hold. Water was indeed seeping through the hull. Not much yet, but enough to panic those trapped below. He found his family and pulled them to a drier section, but there was no truly safe place. The ship was taking damage, groaning like a living thing in pain. Another explosion, closer this time. Through a gap in the hull, Aenys saw one of the fleeing ships, a great galley larger than theirs, lifted by a gout of superheated steam and simply torn apart. Bodies and debris rained into the boiling sea. "We're going to die," someone was sobbing. "Gods, we're all going to die." "Keep bailing," the captain's voice harsh and commanding. "We're not dead yet." Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning in the chaos. The explosions continued, each one feeling like the world's death throes. Ash piled on the deck until men had to shovel it overboard to keep from being buried. The air was so thick with smoke and sulfur that breathing felt like drowning. But slowly, impossibly, they pulled away from the destruction. The waves grew smaller. The air, while still fouled, became breathable again. When Aenys finally climbed back on deck, he saw that perhaps a third of those who'd started the journey were dead. From burns, from drowning, from simply giving up and throwing themselves into the sea. He looked back at where Valyria had been. The entire peninsula was gone. Just gone. In its place was a roiling hellscape of smoke and steam and firewaters boiling around broken peaks that had once been mountains. The smoking sea, someone would call it later. A wound in the world that would not heal for centuries, if ever the old ones had returned to their depths. But their fury remained, burning in the waters, poisoning the air, turning what had been the heart of the greatest empire in history into a dead zone where nothing living could survive. 3 days after, the ship limped into Valante's harbour with half its passengers dead and most of the rest dying. The Valantean authorities quarantined them immediately. Too many ships were arriving with sick refugees, with stories of destruction that seemed too vast to be real. But the stories were real. Every ship confirmed it. Valyria was gone. The freehold had fallen in a single day of fire and ash, just as the prophetess had warned. Aenys sat in a quarantine house, his family alive but traumatized, and wrote. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the quill, but he had to write, had to record what he'd seen. The doom has come, as I knew it would, as so many of us knew it would, though we lacked the courage to speak it aloud. We delved too deep. We woke what should have remained sleeping. And we have paid the price for our hubris. The flames did not simply burn, they consumed. Not just wood and flesh, but stone. The very mountains melted like wax. And the things I saw rising from beneath, I do not have words for them. They were old beyond counting, old enough that our entire civilization, 5,000 years of glory, was merely a moment's distraction to them. We thought we had bound them. We thought we had mastered them, turned their power to our purposes. We were wrong. You cannot bind such forces permanently. You can only borrow their strength for a time. And when that time ends, the debt comes due. I pray that whoever reads this, if anyone survives to read it, learns from our mistake. There are forces in this world that must not be disturbed, powers that should remain buried. The earth has memory longer than ours and patience beyond human understanding. We forgot that, and for forgetting, an entire civilization has been erased. Let Valyria's fall serve as warning. Pride and power without wisdom lead only to ash. He set down his quill as his daughter cried out in her sleep, nightmares of fire and shapes moving through flames. Gennara held her rocking and whispering comfort that felt hollow in the face of what they'd witnessed. Outside, the sun was setting over Volantis, a city that would now become one of the great powers of the world, feeding on the corpse of the freehold. The Valyrian roads would crumble. The colonies would fight among themselves. The dragons that had survived would scatter, and the magic that had made the freehold supreme would fade from the world like a dream upon waking. But some things would survive. House Targaryen safe on Dragonstone, a few noble families who'd fled in time, and the warnings, the stories, the knowledge, purchased in blood and ash, that there are some prices too high to pay, some depths too dangerous to plumb. Enis closed his journal and hid it among his possessions. Someday, perhaps, someone would want to know what really happened. Why the greatest civilization the world had ever known fell in a single day. And he wanted them to know the truth. That doom comes not from outside, but from within. From the choices made in arrogance and maintained in pride. From the refusal to listen to warnings until it was far, far too late. The 14 flames were gone. The freehold was ash. And somewhere beneath the smoking sea, in the deep places where even now the waters boiled and stone men wandered in madness, the old ones slept once more, waiting, always waiting, for men to forget, to grow proud again, to dig too deep and wake them once more. The nightmares had not stopped. Enis woke gasping in the pre-dawn darkness, his wife's hand gentle on his shoulder. The same dream, always the same. The peninsula breaking apart, the shapes rising from beneath, the fires that burned colors no fire should burn. 5 years had passed since the doom, and still his mind returned to it every night. Hush, Gennara whispered. It's past. We survived, but had they truly? Yes. Their bodies had escaped the flames. Their family lived diminished, traumatized, but alive. Yet some part of Enis had remained in those burning waters, watching the world end, and he did not think he would ever get it back. He rose quietly and moved to his small writing desk. The apartment they'd secured in Volantis was modest. 3 rooms in a building that had once housed merchants' clerks. A far cry from the Belleris manse with its dragon-carved pillars and heated floors. But it was home now. Home and safety, and a place to record what must not be forgotten. The journal had grown thick over the years. He'd written everything he could remember about the last days of Valyria, about the warnings ignored, about the mining operations that had delved too deep. But lately, he'd begun collecting other accounts, stories from fellow survivors, fragments of knowledge rescued from the ashes. There were more survivors than anyone had initially believed. Thousands had fled in those final days and weeks, scattered across Essos. Most had gone to Volantis, the eldest daughter of Valyria, best positioned to claim the freehold's legacy. But others had fled to Lys, to Myr, to Pentos and Bravos, and even distant Korth. And all of them carried pieces of the truth. Enis had made it his mission to gather those pieces before they were lost forever. Written in Volantis, 8 years after the doom, the century of blood had begun. That was what the chroniclers were calling it. The wars that erupted when Valyria fell and left a power vacuum across half the known world. Volantis, claiming itself the true heir to the freehold, had launched campaigns to reconquer the other free cities. They'd failed, but the fighting continued. Everywhere Enis looked, he saw the freehold's children tearing each other apart over the corpse of their mother. It disgusted him almost as much as it saddened him. He sat now in a tavern in the lower city, meeting with a man who'd sent word he had information. The man arrived, hooded, nervous, constantly glancing at the door. "You're Beleris?" the man asked. "I am. You said you had documents from before the Doom?" The man pulled a leather satchel from beneath his cloak. "My master was a merchant, traded in old books, rare manuscripts. He had clients in Valyria, collectors among the noble families. When the city fell, his whole business collapsed. Most of his inventory was destroyed or looted in the chaos he opened the satchel. But some things survived." Enis leaned forward as the man spread several items on the table. A partially burned scroll, a book with a cover of some strange material. Not leather, not wood, but something in between, and a small stone tablet covered in the symbols Enis recognized immediately. The pre-Valyrian script, the warnings carved by whatever civilization had existed before the Freehold. Where did these come from? The scroll is from the library of House Caleres, or what was salvaged of it. One of the Meisters escaped with a satchel of documents. He died of lung rot 2 years ago, and his widow sold his possessions to pay debts. The man touched the book reverently. This is older. My master said it came from the deep archives beneath the 14th flame, written in a dialect of Valyrian so ancient that even the dragonlord families couldn't read it, and the tablet found by a slave work crew 20 years before the Doom. The overseer kept it as a curiosity. He died in the destruction, but his son brought it with him when he fled. The man looked up, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I've heard you're collecting this sort of thing, paying well for it." I'm Enis pulled out a purse. How much they haggled. Not because Enis cared about the price, but because to seem too eager would raise suspicion. Finally, they settled on a sum that would feed the man's family for months, and Enis took possession of the artifacts. Back in his apartment, he examined them more carefully. The scroll was badly damaged, but what remained spoke of mining operations in the deep galleries, the same galleries where Enis himself had witnessed the impossible. The writer, someone named Meister Indros, had documented strange phenomena with scientific precision: temperature fluctuations, unexplained sounds, slaves who reported visions and nightmares after working in certain tunnels. "Cannot be natural," one passage read. "The rock itself seems to resist our tools. Steel that should last years dulls in days. And the workers, they change. Subtly at first, they grow quiet, withdrawn. Then they begin speaking of the old ones, of things that sleep and dream beneath the mountains. 3 slaves this month have thrown themselves into the forges rather than return below. When I asked one why, before he leapt, he said, 'Better the fire than what's waking in the dark.'" Enis set the scroll aside and examined the book. The cover was indeed strange, warm to the touch despite the cool evening, with a texture like scaled leather but harder. Dragon leather. He'd heard the dragonlord families sometimes bound their most precious texts in the shed scales of their bonded beasts. He opened it carefully. The pages were thin but remarkably well preserved, covered in tight script that hurt his eyes to read. The language was High Valyrian, yes, but so archaic he had to puzzle out many of the words. It appeared to be a historical text, discussing the founding of the Freehold. In the days before fire, when the mountains were cold stone and the dragons were but legends in the hearts of desperate men, our ancestors came to this peninsula Seeking refuge from the wars that consumed the world, they found, instead, a tomb. The mountains were hollow, not by nature's hand, but by design, carved from within by architects whose names are lost to time. And in those hollows dwelt the old ones, sleeping their long sleep, dreaming dreams that seeped into the rock and made it sacred and terrible. Our ancestors were fools. They should have fled. Instead, they sought to use what they found. They learned the old ways, the blood magics that could bind sleeping gods and turn their power to mortal purpose. They cut themselves and bled upon the stone. They spoke words in languages not meant for human tongues. And they bound the old ones, forced them deeper into sleep, and stole their fire. From that theft came our glory. The 14 flames woke, not mountains becoming volcanoes, but prisons given power, channeling the force of what dwelt beneath. We built our empire on stolen fire, and for 5,000 years we told ourselves the theft was conquest, that we had mastered what we found. But one does not master such forces. One only borrows them, and all debts eventually come due. The text ended there, the rest of the pages too damaged to read. But Aenys felt ice in his veins despite the warm night. This was it, confirmation of what Maester Indros had told him decades ago, what the prophetess had preached, what he himself had witnessed in the deep galleries. Valyria had not discovered fire, they had stolen it, and the doom had been the price of that theft. Written in Volantis, 12 years after the doom, Aenys had become something of an authority on pre-Valyrian history. Though few took his scholarship seriously, the surviving noble families, those who'd made it to safety, preferred not to think too deeply about what had happened. It was easier to believe the doom had been a natural disaster, a terrible but comprehensible volcanic event, than to face the truth of what their ancestors had done. But Aenys pressed on. He'd interviewed dozens of survivors now, collecting their stories, cross-referencing accounts, building a picture of the freehold's final days. And patterns emerged. The tremors had been increasing for at least 50 years before the doom. Mining operations had been troubled for decades. Strange phenomena, lights in the sky, sounds from deep places, slaves speaking in tongues they didn't know, had been reported with growing frequency. And through it all, the 14 had insisted everything was fine, that their power was absolute, that Valyria would stand eternal. Pride, that was what had killed the freehold. Not the old ones alone, but the refusal to acknowledge that human power had limits. You should write a proper history, his daughter Saera told him one evening. She was 19 now, a woman grown, working as a scribe to help support the family. Everything you've collected, all the accounts and documents, put them together. Let people know what really happened. Who would read it? Who would believe it? Future generations, people who didn't live through it, who aren't afraid of the truth. She touched his journal. Father, you've spent 12 years gathering this knowledge. Don't let it die with you. He knew she was right, but the task felt overwhelming. How could he make people understand? How could words on parchment convey the horror of watching an empire vanish in flames, of seeing things rise from beneath that should exist only in nightmares? Still, he began, working late into the nights, organizing his notes, structuring a narrative, not just his own account, but a comprehensive history. The founding of Valyria, the binding of the old ones, the slow decay as the bindings weakened, and the final catastrophic collapse. He called it The Price of Fire, a true history of Valyria's fall, written in Volantis 20 years after the Doom. The manuscript was nearly complete when the visitor arrived. Aenys had not left his apartment in weeks, too absorbed in his work to attend to much else. Jainara had taken to bringing him food and forcing him to eat, worried he would work himself to death. So when someone knocked at his door late one evening, he almost didn't answer. But something made him rise and open it. The man standing there was young, perhaps 30, with the silver gold hair and purple eyes of pure Valyrian blood. He wore traveling clothes, dusty from the road, and carried a leather satchel much like the one Aenys had bought years ago. "Lord Baleris?" the man asked. "Just Aenys now." The titles died with the freehold. "My name is Gaemon Targaryen. I come from Dragonstone on behalf of my family." Aenys felt his pulse quicken. House Targaryen, the ones who had escaped before the Doom, heeding their daughter's prophetic dreams. They'd established themselves as the dominant power on Dragonstone, the last significant Valyrian outpost in Westeros. "What does House Targaryen want with an old scholar? We've heard of your work. Your collection of accounts from before the Doom, your research into what truly happened." Gaemon's expression was serious. "My Lord Father believes this knowledge is too important to be lost. He sent me to offer you patronage, resources to complete your history, scribes to help copy and preserve it, and eventually passage to Dragonstone, where your manuscripts would be housed in our library." Why? Why does House Targaryen care about the past when they're busy building a future in Westeros? Because those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Gaemon pulled a scroll from his satchel and handed it to Aenys. "This is from my cousin Daenys, the dreamer, they call her, the one whose visions warned us to flee. She's an old woman now, but her dreams have not stopped. And lately she dreams of dragons returning, of fire waking in the world once more, of the old mistakes being made again by those who never learned the lessons of Valyria." Aenys unrolled the scroll. It was written in a shaking hand, the writing of someone very old or very ill, but the words were clear. "To the keeper of memory, the dragons sleep, but they will wake. Fire calls to fire across the centuries. What happened to Valyria can happen again, in new forms, in new lands. Record the truth, preserve the warning. Let those who come after know the price of hubris, so they might choose wisdom instead." "She's dying," Gaemon said quietly. "This may be her last prophecy, but she insisted I find you before the end, insisted your work must be preserved." Aenys felt tears prick his eyes. For 20 years he'd labored in obscurity, dismissed by most as a fearful old man obsessed with the past. And now this. Validation, support, the promise that his work would outlive him. "Tell your Lord Father I accept, but I have conditions." "Name them." "The history must be copied and distributed, not locked away in one library where it might be lost, but spread across the known world. I want copies in Old Town, in Bravos, in the Citadel if they'll accept it. I want sellswards and merchants to carry it. I want anyone who seeks knowledge to be able to find it." Ambitious. Necessary. The Doom happened because people refused to see the truth, even when it was staring them in the face. I won't let my work be buried the same way. The warning must survive. Gaemon smiled slightly. "I think my father will find your terms acceptable." Written in Dragonstone, 30 years after the Doom, Aenys was an old man now, his hair white as snow, his hands so twisted with age he could barely hold a quill. But the work was done. The Price of Fire existed in dozens of copies, housed in libraries across the known world. House Targaryen had been true to their word, providing the resources to see it completed and distributed. And more than that, they'd collected additional materials, accounts from survivors in Lys and Tyrosh, fragments of pre-Valyrian texts, even specimens of the strange stone with its painful carvings. The library at Dragonstone now held what was likely the most comprehensive collection of Valyrian history anywhere in the world. And at its heart, carefully preserved in a glass case, was Aenys's original journal, the day-by-day account of Valyria's final years, written in his own hand. He stood before that case now, leaning heavily on a cane, staring at the young man he'd been when he first started writing. So much had changed, so much had been lost. "Do you think anyone will listen?" Daenerys Targaryen's voice, weak but clear. She sat in a wheeled chair nearby, wrapped in blankets despite the warm day. They were both ancient now, survivors of a dead world, keepers of memories most wished to forget. Some will, most won't. That's the nature of humanity. Aenys turned to look at her. We learn slowly, painfully, and often not at all. But some will read the history. Some will understand the warning. And perhaps, when the next great empire rises and begins to think itself eternal, someone will remember what happened to Valyria and choose differently. That's all we can hope for. Daenerys said that wisdom might win out over pride just once. Through the window, Aenys could see dragons circling above the castle. House Targaryen's last three, the survivors of the Doom and their offspring. Beautiful creatures, dangerous creatures, symbols of power that could build empires or destroy them. Fire was like that, useful, necessary, but never truly controlled. The Valyrians had forgotten that, had believed their magic, and might made them masters of forces that predated humanity by eons. And they had paid the price. "I'm tired," Aenys said quietly. "I've done what I can, written what needed to be written. The rest is up to those who come after." "Then rest," Aenys told him. "You've earned it. The warning has been given. Let history judge whether anyone had the wisdom to heed it." That night, Aenys died in his sleep, peacefully, without pain, surrounded by his family and the books that had become his life's work. The world moved on. The century of blood raged across Essos. House Targaryen consolidated power on Dragonstone. And slowly, over generations, Valyria became a legend, a cautionary tale told to children, a subject of scholarly debate, a mystery that would fascinate and terrify in equal measure. But in libraries and archives, in the hands of careful historians and curious students, the Price of Fire survived, copied, translated, preserved against the ravages of time. A warning from the dead to the living, that power without wisdom leads to ash, that there are forces in the world that must not be disturbed, that empires which forget their mortality learn harsh lessons. And deep beneath the smoking sea, where the waters still boiled and no living thing could survive, the old ones slept once more, waiting, always waiting, for the next empire to rise, the next generation to forget, the next fools to dig too deep and wake what should stay sleeping. The cycle was not broken. Perhaps it never could be. But at least the warning survived, recorded in careful detail, preserved across centuries, and perhaps, just perhaps, someone, someday, would be wise enough to heed it before it was too late. Again, Marwyn closed the final page of Aenys Belleris's journal and sat in silence for a long time. Dawn was breaking over Old Town. Through the narrow window of his cell, he could see the first light painting, the high tower in shades of gold and amber. The city was waking, bakers stoking their ovens, fishermen preparing their boats, the endless rhythm of life continuing as it always had. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that dragons had returned to the world, and with them, perhaps, the old mistakes. His candle had burned down to a stub. His eyes ached from hours of reading by its failing light. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of what he'd learned. Valyria had not fallen to a natural disaster. It had fallen because it had built its entire civilization on a foundation it did not understand, had stolen power from forces that should never have been disturbed, bound sleeping gods with magics it could not truly control. And when those bindings inevitably failed, paid the price in full. And now, dragons flew again. Magic stirred in distant lands. The world was changing in ways the masters refused to acknowledge. History, Marwyn realized, might be preparing to repeat itself. A knock at his door made him start. He quickly covered the journal with other parchments, heart hammering. If Theobald or another Archmaster found what he'd been reading, "Marwyn, are you awake?" He recognized the voice. Archmaster Walgrave, his voice thin with age and confusion. Marwyn opened the door to find the old man standing there in his nightclothes, his chain of office hanging askew. "Archmaester, it's very early." Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about something. Can't quite remember what. Walgrave's roomy eyes fixed on Marwyn with unexpected sharpness. "You've been reading it, haven't you? The Valyrian journal. The one Theobald told you to leave alone." There was no point in lying. "Yes, Archmaster." "Good. Someone should." Walgrave shuffled into the cell without invitation and settled onto Marwyn's narrow bed with a wheeze. "I read it once, 60 years ago, when I was young like you, full of curiosity and questions. It terrified me. Still does, when I can remember it clearly." "You knew what it contained, and you just left it buried." "What else could I do?" The old man's hands trembled as they often did. "I brought it to the conclave, argued that we should study it, learn from it, warn people about the dangers of—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "Of meddling with forces beyond human understanding. But the other masters, they said it was just one man's account, unreliable, tainted by trauma and fear. They said the Doom was a volcanic event, nothing more, and that to suggest otherwise was to give credence to magic and superstition. But you didn't believe them." I knew better. I'd seen other accounts, other fragments. The Citadel has collected them over the centuries. Testimonies from survivors, pre-Valyrian artifacts, even a few prophecies that predicted the fall. Walgrave's gaze grew distant. "But the Citadel has a mission, boy. Order, reason, the systematic understanding of the world through observation and logic. Magic. Magic is the opposite of order. It's chaos given form. And if magic is real, if there are forces in the world that cannot be understood or controlled through reason alone, then what is the purpose of Meisters?" Marwyn felt a chill despite the warm morning. So they chose to deny it, to bury the evidence. Not deny, exactly. Ignore, dismiss, file away where curious minds wouldn't stumble across it. The old man's expression was infinitely sad. "I tried to keep studying it anyway. Spent years collecting accounts, cross-referencing sources. But the weight of it, The knowledge that we're so fragile, that civilization can end in a single day, that there are things beneath the earth that view us as we might view ants. He shook his head. It broke something in me. I started forgetting things, important things, names, dates, what I'd eaten for breakfast. The other Meisters said it was age, but I know better. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry. Then why tell me this? Why not just let me turn the journal over to the conclave and forget I ever found it? Walgrave looked at him with sudden clarity, the fog lifting from his eyes for just a moment. Because dragons have returned, boy. After more than a century, there are dragons in the world again. And where dragons go, magic follows. The old powers are waking, and all the denial in the world won't change that. His hand gripped Marwyn's arm with surprising strength. Someone needs to remember what happened to Valyria. Someone needs to understand the warning. And if the Citadel won't do it, then you must. What would you have me do? Copy the journal, study it, cross-reference it with everything else we have on Valyria and the Doom. And when you understand, truly understand, what the warning means, decide what to do with that knowledge. Keep it, spread it, burn it if you think that's wisest. But make it a choice, not an accident of ignorance. The old man stood, his moment of lucidity already fading. Where am I? Oh, your cell. I came to tell you something. Can't remember what. Must have been important. He shuffled toward the door, then paused. Was I talking about dragons? I dream of dragons sometimes. Beautiful, terrible things. Fire made flesh. He left, mumbling to himself, and Marwyn was alone with his thoughts and the weight of secret history. He spent the next 3 weeks in a fury of activity. By day, he performed his duties, attending lessons, copying texts, running errands for the archmaesters. But by night, he worked. He copied Enis Beleris's journal word for word, translating the archaic Valyrian into the common tongue as he went. He searched the restricted vaults for other materials and found them, shipping manifests from Volantis in the years after the Doom, listing refugees and their possessions. Testimonies collected by long-dead Meisters from survivors. Even a copy, worn and water-damaged, of The Price of Fire, the history Enis had written in his final decades. The picture that emerged was damning. Valyria had known. Not everyone, perhaps, but enough people had understood that something was wrong. The tremors increasing, the mines becoming dangerous, the warnings from slaves and Meisters, and even some of the lesser dragonlord families. But the 14, the ruling families, had refused to listen, had silenced dissent, dismissed warnings, and continued their operations right up until the moment the peninsula shattered beneath them. Pride and power, the belief that human will could master any force, the refusal to acknowledge limits, and 400 years later, as dragons returned to the world and magic stirred once more, Marwyn saw the same patterns emerging. The Maesters denied that magic was real, even as reports came in of shadow assassins and fire priests performing miracles. The nobles of Westeros squabbled over power, blind to the greater dangers. And in the Far East, a girl with 3 dragons was building an army, wielding forces she might not fully understand. History, preparing to repeat itself. But what could he do? He was a novice, powerless, his warnings likely to be dismissed as readily as Enis Beleris's had been. Unless an idea began to form, dangerous, possibly futile, but he had to try. He requested an audience with the conclave, invoking his right as a student to present research for evaluation. It was granted. Such requests were rare enough to be taken seriously, and Marwyn had proven himself a diligent scholar. The conclave met in a high chamber lined with books, the archmaesters seated in a half-circle, their chains of office marking them as masters of various disciplines. Theobald was there, his expression sour. Walgrave attended as well, though he seemed barely aware of his surroundings. And at the centre sat the Grand Master, an ancient man whose name Marwyn could never quite remember. "Novice Marwyn," the Grand Maester said, his voice like dry parchment. "You wish to present research?" "I do, Grand Maester, on the subject of the Doom of Valyria." A ripple of interest moved through the assembly. The Doom was a popular subject among scholars, distant enough to be safe, dramatic enough to be interesting. "Proceed." Marwyn had prepared carefully. He began with accepted facts, the date of the Doom, its immediate effects, the destruction of the peninsula. Then, slowly, he introduced Enis Belleris's account, presenting it as a recently discovered primary source. Describes phenomena that suggest the Doom was not merely a volcanic event, he said, watching the Archmaesters' faces. Tremors increasing over decades, mining operations troubled by unexplained phenomena, and most significantly, evidence of pre-Valyrian civilization, ruins and artifacts that suggest others lived in the region before the Freehold, and may have understood dangers the Valyrians did not. Interesting speculation, Theobald said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. However, one man's account, written in traumatic circumstances, hardly constitutes reliable evidence. "I've found corroborating sources." Marwyn produced copies of the shipping manifests, testimonies. Multiple survivors reported similar phenomena, and the pre-Valyrian artifacts have been documented by Maesters across 3 centuries. Documented, yes, but their significance is debatable. The Grand Master leaned forward. "What is your thesis, Novice Marwyn? What are you claiming?" This was the moment. Marwyn took a breath. "I claim that Valyria fell not because of natural disaster alone, but because they disturbed forces they did not understand. That their mining operations awakened something that had been deliberately sealed by earlier inhabitants, and that—" he paused, "and that with dragons returned to the world, we may be approaching a time when similar mistakes could be made again." Silence filled the chamber. Then, to Marwyn's surprise, several of the Archmaesters laughed. "Dragons!" One of them said, "You believe in dragons now." "What next?" Grumpkins and Snarks. "Dragons have been confirmed by multiple independent sources from Essos. Rumors, exaggerations, perhaps large lizards, mistaken for dragons by ignorant peoples." Theobald stood. "Grand Maester, this novice has wasted our time with fairy tales dressed as scholarship. I move that his research be rejected, and that he be reassigned to more practical studies, copying texts perhaps, or assisting in the kitchens." But Walgrave spoke up, his voice surprisingly strong. "The boy raises valid questions, questions we've been avoiding for generations." "You're senile, Walgrave. Everyone knows it." "Senile or not, I'm right." The old man's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "The Citadel has been collecting evidence about Valyria's fall for 400 years. Evidence that suggests magic was real, that forces exist beyond our understanding, that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we admit. But we've chosen to ignore it, to file it away, to pretend that if we don't acknowledge something, it doesn't exist. because to do otherwise, the Grand Maester said quietly, would be to admit that our entire purpose, the systematic, rational understanding of the world, has limits, that there are things beyond the reach of reason. Yes, Walgrave said, and we should admit it, because denial doesn't make us wise, it makes us blind. The chamber erupted in argument. Some archmeisters supported Walgrave, others dismissed him. Marwyn stood silent, watching the debate rage, realizing that this was the crux of everything. The Citadel couldn't accept magic because doing so would undermine its very foundation. Better to deny reality than face an uncomfortable truth, just like the 14 families of Valyria. Finally, the Grand Master raised his hand for silence. Novice Marwyn, your research is intriguing, but insufficient for the conclusions you draw. I suggest you continue your studies, perhaps focusing on more conventional historical analysis. The conclave is adjourned. Dismissed. Politely, but firmly. His warning ignored, just as Enis Beleris's had been. Marwyn returned to his cell to find a raven waiting. The bird was larger than most, with feathers so black they seemed to drink the light. It regarded him with eyes that held uncomfortable intelligence. Around its leg was a small cylinder. He removed the message with shaking hands and unrolled it. The Citadel will not listen. They never do. If you wish to truly understand, come to the other side of the world. There are those who remember what the Meisters have forgotten. Your uncle Marwyn stared at the message. His uncle, Marwyn the Mage, the one who'd left the Citadel decades ago to study forbidden knowledge in Ashai and beyond. The family's shame. The warning example of what happened when you abandoned reason for magic. Or perhaps, Marwyn thought, the only one wise enough to seek truth wherever it led. He looked at the copied journal on his desk, at the materials he'd gathered, knowledge preserved but unheeded, a warning given but unheard. What was the point of knowledge if no one would use it? Outside, Old Town continued its daily rhythm, and far across the narrow sea, in lands where dragons flew and fire priests preached, history stirred, old powers waking, old mistakes waiting to be made again. Marwyn made his decision. He packed his materials carefully, the copied journal, his research, everything he'd learned. Some he would hide in the Citadel's archives, preserved for future seekers. The rest would come with him. Because if the Masters wouldn't carry the warning, he would find those who would listen, who understood that empires rise and fall, that power has costs, that there are forces in the world requiring not just knowledge, but wisdom. The doom had happened once. It could happen again. But perhaps, if someone remembered the lessons, if the warning reached the right ears, if wisdom won out over pride just once, perhaps this time could be different. Or perhaps not. Perhaps humanity was doomed to repeat its mistakes eternally, each generation thinking itself wiser than the last, each empire believing itself eternal until the moment it fell. But Marwyn had to try. For Enis Beleris, who'd spent his life recording the truth. For Archmeister Walgrave, broken by knowledge too heavy to carry alone. For all those who died when the doom came, their warnings ignored, their wisdom dismissed. And for those yet to be born, who might face similar choices in days to come. The raven cawed once, as if in approval. Marwyn gathered his things and left the Citadel behind, carrying with him the weight of lost empires and the hope that this time, maybe this time, someone would listen before it was too late.